The groceries were getting heavy. I had been standing on our porch for nearly 10 minutes, shifting the paper bags from arm to arm, waiting for my husband to open the front door. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see the dining room light glowing warm and steady. I could see the table I had carefully set that morning, the good plates, the candles, the folded napkins. And sitting at that table like she had always lived there was Diane, Richard's mother. She did not even glance at the door. I knocked again. "Richard? Please, these bags are heavy." He appeared from the hallway. Our eyes met through the glass. And then, slowly and deliberately, he turned the lock. Not to open it. To make sure it stayed closed. "Maybe it's time you moved on, Patricia." His voice was flat and cold. Then he walked away. I stood on the porch of the house I had lived in for 22 years. The groceries slipped to the ground. My heart felt like it had dropped with them. But before I tell you what happened next, my name is Patricia Weston. I am 54 years old, originally from Savannah, Georgia. And if stories like this keep you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to this channel. You will not want to miss what comes next. The motel room was small and smelled like old carpet and bleach. The bed had a thin blanket and the heater made a ticking sound all night. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the wall. I kept replaying the moment Richard turned that lock. Over and over. The way his eyes met mine, and then looked away. The way Diane sat at my table like a queen who had finally taken her throne. The humiliation burned. I will not pretend it didn't. 22 years of marriage. 22 years of cooking his meals, showing up to his work events, building a home together, and that was how it ended. Through a locked door. But here is what Richard didn't understand. Beneath the hurt and the shock of it all, there was something else sitting inside me. A quiet, steady calm. Like a stone resting at the bottom of a river while everything above it rushed and churned. Because 3 days before that night, I had found something. I hadn't gone looking for it. I was searching for our car insurance papers in the filing cabinet in Richard's home office when I came across a folder I had never seen before. It was tucked behind a row of old tax files, and it was stuffed with papers. Bank statements, property documents, and one letter that made my hands go cold. I had read that letter 3 times before I put it back exactly where I found it. I did not want Richard to know I had seen it. Not yet. Not until I understood what it meant. That night in the motel room, the words came back to me in pieces. The letter had been written by Diane, addressed to a real estate attorney. In it, she laid out a plan, a very specific plan, to transfer the property into Richard's name alone. She wrote about timing. She wrote about how to handle my expected resistance. She had even suggested that if I were difficult, Richard should consider taking legal steps to remove me. They had been planning this for months. As I lay on that thin motel mattress, I started thinking back over the last year. The way Richard had stopped including me in any financial conversations. The way Diane had started coming by more often, always with a comment about the house, how the kitchen needed updating, how the garden wasn't being properly maintained. I had brushed it off as her usual nosiness. But now every small moment lined up into something much bigger. A pattern. A quiet plan being built around me while I smiled and cooked and trusted the man I had married. They believed I was too trusting to notice. What they had failed to understand was that the house they had locked me out of was not legally as simple as they thought. I left the motel early the next morning. I did not call Richard. I did not text him. I sat in a diner 2 blocks away, ordered coffee and toast, and thought carefully about what to do next. Confronting him directly was not the answer. Richard was a careful man. If I showed my hand too soon, he would have time to prepare. Diane would coach him on what to say. They would deny everything, or worse, they would move faster than I could respond. I needed someone who understood the legal side of things. Someone I could trust completely. My father had passed away 6 years earlier, but before he died, he had used a lawyer named Theodore Harmon to handle some estate matters. Mr. Harmon was semi-retired now, but his office was still on the same street downtown. I had not spoken to him since the estate was settled, but I still had his number saved in my phone. I sat in that diner, holding my coffee cup with both hands, and I dialed. He answered on the 3rd ring. I explained as briefly and clearly as I could what had happened. The lockout, the letter I had found in Richard's office, the documents I had photographed before putting everything back exactly as I found it. There was a long pause on the line. Then Mr. Harmon said, "Patricia, you may want to come in today." His office was quiet when I arrived. A receptionist led me to a back room that smelled like old books and leather. Mr. Harmon stood when I walked in, older than I remembered, thinner, but with sharp, steady eyes. He shook my hand and told me to sit down. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember the renovation you and Richard did on the house?" he said slowly. "About 12 years ago? The new kitchen, the rear extension?" I remembered it clearly. We had spent nearly $80,000. A large portion had come from my inheritance, money my father left me when his first investment property was sold. Mr. Harmon opened a folder on his desk. "Your father was a very careful man," he said. "When you received that inheritance, he insisted on a specific legal protection, a clause attached to any major investment of those funds." He turned a document to face me. "If Richard tries to force you out of the property or to transfer ownership without your full agreement, these protections could expose him to serious legal and financial consequences." I stared at the page. My hands were steady now. The grief of the previous night had not disappeared, but beneath it something stronger was taking shape. What Richard thought was a closed door had just opened when I was only starting to walk through. I thanked Mr. Harmon and left his office with copies of the key documents tucked carefully in my bag. He advised me to say nothing to Richard yet. "Let him believe he is winning," Mr. Harmon said quietly. "Comfortable people make mistakes." That afternoon, I sent Richard a polite text. Short and calm. I told him I understood the situation had become difficult and that I would like to arrange a time to come collect a few personal items. I kept my tone neutral, almost soft. His reply came within minutes. "Fine. Tuesday works. Try to keep it brief." That was it. No apology. No explanation. Not even a question about whether I was okay. Just a schedule and a command. I read it twice and set my phone face down on the passenger seat of my car. 22 years. And that was what I got back. 20 minutes later, another message arrived. This one from Diane. It said, "Patricia, I think we both know this is for the best. I hope you can be reasonable about all of this and not make things harder than they need to be." I saved both messages without responding. Mr. Harmon had told me to document everything. Every text. Every voicemail, every email. These small moments of confidence from Richard and Diane were not problems for me. They were gifts, because confident people rarely notice when the ground beneath them is already starting to crack. Tuesday came and I drove over to collect a few things. I kept the visit short and did not say much. Richard stood in the kitchen watching me as I moved through the house, arms crossed, expression blank. I took only what I needed, some clothing, personal papers, and a small box of things that had belonged to my mother. Nothing that could be considered joint property. Nothing that would start an argument. As I loaded my car, our neighbor Beverly came out onto her front porch. Beverly was a quiet woman in her early 60s who had lived next door for nearly 15 years. We had always been friendly. She waited until Richard went back inside, then crossed the yard toward me with a careful, hesitant expression. "Patricia," she said softly. "I was going to call you. I didn't know how." Something in her voice made me stop. "What is it, Beverly?" She hesitated. Then she told me. Over the past 3 weeks, a woman had been visiting the house. Younger than me, Beverly said. She arrived in a dark blue car, usually in the evenings, and stayed for hours at a time. Once, Beverly had seen Richard walk her to the door, and they had stood very close together on that same porch where he had locked me out. I thanked Beverly quietly. Then I got in my car and sat very still for a long moment. Everything I had suspected was now real. I expected the pain to hit me like a wave. I had been bracing for it sitting in my car outside my old home. But what came instead was something different, a clean, sharp clarity. A stillness that surprised even me. The affair explained everything. The distance of the past year. The evenings Richard came home late, without explanation. The way he had stopped meeting my eyes during conversations. I had told myself it was work stress. I had talked myself out of every warning my gut had tried to give me. Because I did not want to believe the man I married was capable of this. But now I could see it. And seeing clearly meant I could stop being confused. I could start being prepared instead. What I did not expect was how quickly Richard moved to shape the story around his version of events. Within days of locking me out, he had told several people that I had walked out on my own. That I had been unhappy for years. That he had tried everything. A colleague of mine called to check on me and casually mentioned that Richard had told her that version at the market. A couple we used to share dinners with had reached out to him. Not to me. Diane was spreading the same story. I was certain of it. They were building a wall of words before I could speak a single one of my own. But Mr. Harmon had told me something important. Let them talk. Their version will matter far less when the documents speak. The next time I met with Mr. Harmon, he had spread a large stack of papers across his desk. He had been busy. Using the documents I had photographed in Richard's office and the records we had requested through legal channels, he had built a very clear picture of Richard's financial decisions over the past 18 months. What we found was not just careless. It was deliberate. Richard had quietly shifted certain assets into accounts listed under his name alone. He had made a payment to a contractor for work done on the house without including me in the agreement, work that legally required both of our signatures. He had also signed an agreement with a real estate agent, dated just 9 weeks ago, to begin evaluating the property for sale. My name did not appear anywhere on that agreement. Mr. Harmon laid a printout of one email on top of the pile. This one, he said quietly, is the most important. It was an email from Richard to the real estate agent explaining that the home would be listed once the current personal situation is resolved. He had used those exact words. The current personal situation. That was me. That was our marriage. Reduced to a phrase in a business email. I stared at that page for a long time. Then I told Mr. Harmon I was ready for whatever came next. 2 weeks had passed since the night I was locked out. I was staying in a small furnished apartment I had rented on a monthly basis, using money from my own account, one Richard had no access to. I was sleeping better than I had in months. That surprised me. Then, on a Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard. Patricia, I think we should talk. Really talk. I've booked a table for Saturday night, our anniversary. I thought it might be good for both of us to sit down like adults and figure out the path forward. Let me know if you're willing. I read it twice. Then I took a screenshot and forwarded it immediately to Mr. Harmon. His response came the following morning, and it made me smile. Attend the dinner. This is exactly the opportunity we have been waiting for. He wants you to sit across from him and agree to his terms quietly. We are going to give him a very different evening. I will be nearby. We will prepare carefully between now and Saturday. I typed back one word. Perfect. Then I put my phone down and looked out the window of my small rented apartment. Saturday was 2 days away. Richard believed he was setting the table for a quiet surrender. He had no idea he was setting it for something else entirely. I learned later, through Beverly, what was happening on the other side of town during those same days. Diane had apparently decided that my absence from the house was as good as permanent. She had gone from visiting twice a week to arriving every single day. Beverly watched her walk through the front door like she owned the place, sometimes carrying shopping bags, sometimes holding paint swatches fanned out in her hand like a woman already redecorating in her mind. She had started planning the changes she wanted to make. Beverly overheard a conversation through the open dining room window one afternoon. Diane had been on the phone, speaking loudly the way she always did when she felt comfortable and unguarded. She was talking about removing the rear garden and replacing it with a paved terrace. She mentioned wanting to repaint the living room a darker color. And then came the part that made my blood run cold when Beverly told me. Diane had mentioned selling the house. Not as a distant possibility. As a plan with a timeline. She said something like, once it's properly in Richard's name, we can move quickly. Beverly had not understood what those words meant at the time, but I did. Diane was already preparing to cash out everything I had built. She had not even waited for the dust to settle. She had believed the fight was already over. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. Saturday arrived gray and cold. I spent the morning at Mr. Harmon's office, not preparing emotionally, but preparing legally. We sat together at his long conference table and organized everything into a clear, logical order. Every document had its place. Every piece of evidence had its purpose. Every number was verified. Mr. Harmon walked me through exactly how the evening would unfold. A younger legal associate of his, Miss Pruitt, would be positioned nearby and available to step in at the right moment. I was not to lose my temper. I was not to raise my voice. I was not to show emotion that Richard could use as a reason to dismiss me. Let him talk, Mr. Harmon said firmly. Let him feel like he is leading the conversation. The moment he starts explaining how he plans to handle the property, you respond. Calmly. Specifically. I nodded. I had rehearsed every line. Not like an actress preparing a performance, more like a surgeon preparing for a procedure. Every word measured. Every pause intentional. Before I left his office that afternoon, Mr. Harmon handed me a slim folder. Keep this in your bag, he said. You won't need all of it. But having it with you means you won't hesitate when the moment comes. I tucked it inside my coat and buttoned it closed. I was ready. The restaurant Richard had chosen was not somewhere we had ever been together before. It was a newer place, quieter and dimmer, with white tablecloths and candles on every table. I walked through the door at exactly the time we had agreed, wearing a simple dark dress, my expression calm. Richard was already seated, and Diane was beside him. That surprised me. I had not expected her to be there. But it did not throw me. If anything, having Diane at the table made things easier. She was the one who had written that letter. She was the one who had set this whole plan in motion. It felt right, somehow, that she should be present to watch it unravel. Richard stood slightly when he saw me approaching. He looked uncertain for just a moment, then smoothed his face back into that easy, controlled expression he always wore when he thought he was in charge. Patricia. He gestured to the seat across from them. I'm glad you came. Diane gave me a small, tight smile. The kind that was not really a smile at all. The kind she had offered me at family gatherings for years. The one that said she was merely tolerating me. I sat down. I placed my bag carefully beside my chair. I unfolded my napkin and laid it in my lap. Thank you for the invitation, I said pleasantly. Let's talk. Richard ordered wine. He kept the conversation light at first, asking how I was settling in, commenting on the weather, making the kind of careful small talk that seemed designed to soften me up. Diane said very little. She watched me with that measuring look she had always used, as if deciding whether I was going to cause problems. Then, after the appetizers arrived, Richard set down his fork and leaned forward. Patricia, I want us to handle this like the reasonable people we are, he said. The house is the main thing we need to sort out. I think if you're honest with yourself, you know that me buying out your share is the cleanest solution. It would give you a fresh start. Money in your account, no complications, no messy back and forth. He said it so smoothly, so reasonably, as if he were offering me a generous gift instead of asking me to hand over everything I had built. I let a moment of silence pass. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down gently. That's interesting, Richard, I said, because I've been looking into the legal structure of the property, the ownership history, the source of the renovation funds. I kept my voice even and quiet. It turns out things are a little more complicated than a simple buyout. Richard's expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes did. He laughed. It was a short, polished sound, not real laughter, but the kind people use when they want to appear unbothered by something that has, in fact, bothered them very much. Complicated how, he said. The house is in both our names. The renovation was years ago. I think you may be overthinking this, Patricia. Diane reached for her wine glass with a small smile. She had not spoken in several minutes. She did not need to. Her confidence filled the space around her like something solid. I reached into my bag. I had thought carefully about which document to place on the table first. Not the most powerful one, I was saving that. But the first one needed to be strong enough to wipe that smile from their faces and replace it with something more useful. Uncertainty. I slid the paper across the white tablecloth toward Richard. It was a copy of the legal clause attached to my father's inheritance funds, clean language, clear terms. Mr. Harmon had highlighted the most important section in yellow. Richard picked it up. He read it once. Then he read it again more slowly. The easy lines around his mouth faded. He set the paper down. Diane leaned over to look at it. The hand holding her wine glass went still. I folded my hands on the table and waited quietly. The confidence of a few minutes ago had not fully disappeared yet, but it had developed a crack. And cracks, I had learned, have a way of spreading fast. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked. His voice was still controlled, but the edges of it had gone tight. "It is a legal document," I said. "It has been on record for years." I simply went and read it. He pushed it back toward me like he could dismiss it by moving it away. "This doesn't change anything. The renovation funds were used on a joint property. That's standard practice." I nodded slowly, as if I were genuinely considering what he said. Then I spoke carefully. "The clause attached to my father's funds states clearly that any investment of those funds into a jointly held property includes a legal protection for the original investor. That is me." I paused. "What that means, Richard, is that if you attempt to sell this house, transfer ownership of it, or remove me from the title without my full and written agreement, you trigger a legal liability. The protected amount would need to be returned at a significantly higher rate than the original sum, with interest calculated from the date of the original investment." The number I mentioned, calmly and clearly, was not a small one. Richard stared at me. Diane had set her wine glass down completely. "That is a rough estimate," I added pleasantly. "Mr. Harmon's office has the precise figures if you'd like them." I watched Richard do the math quietly behind his eyes. The plan he and Diane had spent months building had just become very, very expensive. Diane spoke first. She put both hands flat on the table, a gesture I recognized. She always did that when she wanted to signal that her patience had officially run out. "Patricia, let's be practical," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath it. "You're upset. That's completely understandable. But bringing lawyers and old documents into a personal family situation, it's dramatic. It won't help anyone move forward." "I appreciate your concern," I said warmly. "No one is trying to cheat you," she continued. "Richard wants to give you a fair settlement. Take it. Move on." "You were never—" She stopped herself. I looked at her steadily. "I was never what, Diane?" She straightened in her chair. "This doesn't need to become a legal battle." "I agree completely," I said. "It doesn't. As long as everyone is being honest." I reached into my bag again. This second document was one we had not expected to find so easily. It had surfaced during a search of property records, a printed letter from the real estate agency confirming the terms of Richard's private arrangement with them. The letter referenced me by name. It described me as a non-participating party. And it was dated 6 weeks before Richard had locked me out of my own home. 6 weeks of planning. Committed to paper. Signed. I placed it on the table. Diane looked at it. Then she looked at Richard. And for the first time that evening, Diane had absolutely nothing to say. Richard reached for the document. He read it slowly. Then he placed it face down on the table as if turning it over could somehow make it disappear. "That was a preliminary inquiry," he said. Nothing had been finalized. It was a signed agreement. I said quietly. "Your signature is on page 2. He said nothing. I leaned forward very slightly and kept my voice low and measured. "Richard, I also know about the woman who has been visiting the house." Something shifted in his face, a tightening along the jaw, a quick flicker behind the eyes. Not shame, exactly. More like calculation. Like he was already deciding how to manage this new development. "That has nothing to do with any of this," he said. "You may be right," I said. "Or, it may be more relevant than you think." There are financial records showing that joint accounts were used during the period of your relationship with her. Our joint accounts, restaurants, hotel stays, a weekend trip in March. I did not shout. I did not cry. I stated it the way a person reads from a calendar, plainly and without emotion. Those transactions could be considered misuse of marital funds, I continued, which, in the context of a divorce proceeding, tends to matter quite significantly to judges. Richard's eyes dropped to the table. He was quiet for several long seconds. The man sitting across from me was shrinking, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. Up until that point, Richard had held the shape of a man in control. He had sat straight in his chair. He had kept his voice measured and smooth. He had pushed back on each thing I said with the easy confidence of someone who believed the conversation was still going his way. That changed. He shifted in his seat. He picked up his fork and set it down again, without using it. He glanced at Diane, the first time he had looked at her since I placed the second document on the table. She gave him nothing back. She was staring at the white tablecloth. "Look," Richard said, and his voice had a different texture now, less polished, less certain. "I think we have both said things tonight." "I haven't said very much at all," I told him gently. "I have mostly been showing you papers." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Patricia, I am not finished," I said, keeping my voice soft but steady. He stopped talking. He waited. That was the moment. That small, quiet pause where he stopped and simply waited for me. For 22 years, I had been the one who waited. The one who softened her words before speaking. The one who asked herself whether something was really worth the argument before pressing forward. Not anymore. The table belonged to me now. The conversation belonged to me. And Richard was finally beginning to understand exactly what that meant. I checked my watch. It was exactly the time we had agreed upon. Mr. Harmon appeared near the restaurant entrance, dressed neatly in a dark suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He moved calmly between the occupied tables and stopped beside ours. He looked at Richard, then at Diane, then pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down with quiet authority. "Good evening," he said simply. Richard stared at him. "Who are you?" "Theodore Harmon. I am Patricia's attorney." He set his briefcase on his lap and opened it with a soft click. "I believe you may already be familiar with some of the documents my client has been sharing with you this evening. I have additional copies if needed, along with further materials I think you will want to review before this conversation continues." Diane looked at me. Her mouth had gone tight and small. The easy certainty she had carried into that restaurant, the same certainty she had been carrying for months, was no longer visible on her face. Richard sat very still. The man who had booked this table expecting to walk away with my agreement, my silence, and my signature on his terms was now looking at a lawyer he had not invited, a set of documents he had not prepared for, and a wife he had deeply and fatally underestimated. The room felt very quiet all of a sudden. The kind of quiet that comes just before everything changes. It was Diane who broke first. She had always been a woman who relied on controlling the atmosphere around her. At family dinners and holiday gatherings, at quiet Sunday visits and charity luncheons, she managed every space she entered. She decided the tone. She decided who mattered and who didn't. She decided the outcome before the conversation even started. But sitting across from Mr. Harmon, with his quiet authority and his open briefcase and his patience, she had no ground to stand on. This was not a room she could manage. These were not rules she had written. "Is this really necessary?" she said, directing the question at me rather than at him, as if I were still the person she could appeal to, the one she could lean on to be reasonable. "Yes," I said simply. "Patricia, we are family. You helped plan to remove me from my own home," I said. Still calm. Still steady. "I read your letter, Diane. The one you wrote to the property attorney. The one that mentioned handling my resistance." The color left her face entirely. She turned to Richard. Richard was looking at the table. She turned back to me. And for the first time in 22 years of knowing each other, Diane had nothing ready to say. No polished comeback. No gentle barb wrapped in careful politeness. Nothing. She was simply a woman sitting in a restaurant who had been caught. And she knew it. Richard found his voice before his mother did. Patricia. He leaned forward, and his tone had shifted entirely. The control was gone. What replaced it was something almost desperate. The sound of a man who had never truly been held accountable reaching for any exit he could find. I think there has been a real misunderstanding here. The lockout. I reacted badly. I was angry and I went too far. You know how things can get sometimes. I looked at him. I kept my face still. The real estate inquiry was just exploratory. I wasn't planning anything serious. I only wanted to understand our options. He spread his hands open on the table, an appealing gesture. If you felt excluded from those conversations, I am truly sorry. That was wrong of me. Mr. Harmon glanced at me briefly. I gave a small nod. Richard, Mr. Harmon said, we have a signed agreement between yourself and the real estate agency dated 9 weeks ago. We have emails between you and your mother discussing the timeline for removing Patricia from the property. We have financial records showing misuse of joint funds. And we have the legal documents relating to the inheritance protections. He laid each page out in a neat row across the table. A misunderstanding, Mr. Harmon continued evenly, is forgetting to pass on a phone message. What we have here is a documented pattern of deliberate decisions. The courts will see it exactly the same way. Richard stared at the pages. He said nothing more. Everything that had been hidden came out in the following hour. Not all at once, piece by piece, like furniture being slowly cleared from a room until nothing remains but the bare floor underneath. Mr. Harmon walked through the full timeline with careful precision. The months of planning, the financial shifts, the real estate agreement, the emails between Richard and Diane, the joint funds used without my consent or knowledge. Richard sat through all of it without interrupting. His earlier attempt at backtracking had run out of road. There was nowhere left to go. Diane tried once more. She suggested the documents had been misread, that important context was missing, that everything looked far worse than it really was. Mr. Harmon responded to each point politely, briefly, and with specific facts she could not argue against. And then Richard did something I had not anticipated. He covered his face with his hands. Just for a moment. Then he lowered them and looked at me, really looked at me for the first time since I had walked into that restaurant. I handled this badly, he said quietly. All of it. I did not rush to respond. I let the words sit in the air between us. 22 years of marriage, 12 years of investment in that home, 1 year of slow betrayal, and 3 weeks of being locked outside. All of it pressing into that single moment. He had finally said a true thing. But truth, at this point, was no longer enough. The resolution did not arrive loudly. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting, no broken dishes. It came quietly, the way real endings usually do, with paperwork, with stillness, with a simple weight of facts that cannot be argued away. By the time we left that restaurant, the shape of what would happen next was already clear. Richard could not sell the house without triggering the legal protections tied to my father's funds. He could not transfer ownership without my written consent. Every financial decision he had made over the past year would now be examined as part of the divorce proceedings. The joint funds used during his relationship with the other woman would be carefully factored into the final settlement. His plan, the careful, months-long plan he and Diane had built together, had not just failed. It had reversed entirely. The very steps he had put in place to push me out were now the things that protected me and exposed him. Diane left the restaurant without speaking another word to me. She walked ahead of Richard through the door, back straight, chin lifted. The posture of a woman pretending nothing had happened. But I had seen her face when Mr. Harmon read aloud from her letter to the property attorney. I had seen the exact moment she understood that her private plan had been read, recorded, and would now be used in a court of law. She would not be choosing paint colors for my house. She would not be building her terrace in my garden. It was over. 3 months later, I drove back to the house I had lived in for 22 years. Not as someone collecting the last of her things. Not as someone saying a final goodbye. As someone coming home. The divorce proceedings moved efficiently, guided by every document we had gathered. Richard retained his own attorney, of course, but the evidence against him was too clear and too layered to fight effectively. The legal protections on my father's inheritance funds held firmly in place. The settlement reflected the full extent of Richard's financial decisions, including the joint funds he had used without my knowledge during his affair.
The house remained mine.
I walked up the front path on a quiet morning in early spring. The key was in my hand, not the spare I had been using since the lockout, but the original. My key. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was still and cool. Morning light came through the windows in long, pale strips across the floor. Everything was where I had left it. The antique clock on the mantelpiece. My mother's small painting above the fireplace. The dining table where Diane had once sat like a queen who believed she had already won. I stood in the hallway for a moment and simply breathed. Richard had thought that locking me out was the end of my story in this house. He was wrong. It was the beginning of a different one, written entirely on my own terms. And as I walked through every quiet room that morning, unhurried and unafraid, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt completely, entirely at home.